Hello again, and welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We're in class number 8. Today we're going to be talking about the synagogue. We're continuing to set up the background of the ministry of Jesus in Galilee and other parts of Israel. And one thing that we never see in the Old Testament is the synagogue. But then the 400 years between the Testaments pass, and then all of a sudden we begin reading the Gospels, and the synagogue is mentioned frequently. So I want to go to look at some different issues or information about the synagogue, their construction, the services, some examples of synagogues in ancient Israel. And I think that will be helpful as we continue to study the life of Jesus. Let's go first of all to read one of the major stories about Jesus in the synagogue in Luke chapter 4. Going to begin in verse 15. This is right at the beginning of his ministry. Luke says, "He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.' Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, 'Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing.' All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. 'Isn't this Joseph's son?' they asked. Jesus said to them, 'Surely you will quote this proverb to me, "Physician, heal yourself." And you will tell me, "Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum." Truly, I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right away through the crowd and went on his way. Now, this is one of the first times we see Jesus stand up in the synagogue and lead the readings and also comment. He quotes from a passage in Isaiah 61, 1 through 3, and that's actually a really common part of the synagogue service for the Jews, especially the reading of the law and then the commentary on it. If you look on through the rest of the Old Testament, you see at least 10 different instances where Jesus is located in the synagogue. We're not going to look at every one of these now because we'll cover many of them in other classes. But just notice how many there are here. It's really a place where Jesus spent a lot of time as a faithful Jew. So if you look at all the Gospels, you look at the teaching, you look at the healings, the conflicts that he had, even casting out demons in the synagogue. It's pretty amazing to see how important that was to the life of the Jews. And then as you go on into Acts, then you see Paul also as a good Jew, spending a lot of time in the synagogue, often beginning in a synagogue as he would go on his missionary trips to different cities. He would start in a synagogue teaching, and then from there go on and speak to other people in the city. So once again, the synagogue is an extremely important place for every good Jew, and particularly Jesus as he was going. Now, if you wonder about the development of the synagogue, the idea of worshiping God far away from the temple was a key part of it. As the Jews came to the end of their Old Testament history, as Judah fell into idolatry and began to get further away from God, and eventually Jerusalem was conquered, and the Jews were taken off into exile by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, they began to wonder, how do we function as a nation? How do we worship together? A large part of our identity as a religious people has been taken away because we're no longer in Jerusalem. We're no longer in the promised land. We don't have the temple anymore. That's been destroyed. They probably didn't have the Ark of the Covenant, most likely. They still had some of the priests there, but the heart of what they considered their worship was ripped out. And so they even began to wonder perhaps if God had forgotten them and if the covenant perhaps was suspended or broken now because of their unfaithfulness. And so while they're in exile in Babylon, it seems that they developed the idea of substituting, gathering together and reading the law and the prophets and praying together. They began to substitute that service for the services of the temple. They couldn't offer sacrifices the same way. Of course, they weren't allowed to make their own temple there, but they could gather together in groups of about 10 families or more in different neighborhoods and worship God in that way. And so they began to do this. Probably the earliest archaeological evidence for synagogues comes from Egypt in the 3rd century BC, kind of strange, quite a ways away from Babylon. And then, of course, in Babylon as well. But then as they began to continue, they had more and more synagogues. And then as they came back from exile to Israel, to Jerusalem, to Galilee, they began to build their synagogues, and they carried that back with them. And then, of course, they had the temple in Jerusalem again. But they continued with the practice of the synagogues. And it's estimated that by the time of Jesus, there were around 390 to 490 synagogues in Jerusalem. So if you look at Jerusalem in that time, it's not a huge city. And so that many synagogues would mean there's one about every block or 2 blocks probably. So again, it's very common in the community to have synagogues. Now, what we're looking at here is the oldest known synagogue in Israel. It's located near the town of Jericho, just north of the Dead Sea, and the Wadi Kelts, which is a place we've shown you briefly before and we'll come back to in other places. And so that's just an old picture of it there. Now, the building contained different elements that were just about always present if you go look at any synagogue that's been found. First of all, there was kind of a central meeting hall with columns to both sides and then benches on the sides for people to sit. There was usually what's called a bema, B-E-M-A, which was a platform usually in the center of the synagogue. The Word of God could be read from there in the midst of the people. There was usually a Moses seat, and this is the place from which the reader would then go and sit down and then expound on what had been read. And this is what we just saw Jesus do. He took the scroll, he read the scroll standing up, probably on the bema, and then he gives the scroll back to the assistant, sits down on Moses' seat, and then expounds on what the passage he had read. And the idea was that it's called Moses' seat because if you sat there, you were speaking with the authority of Moses, that Moses had as the leader and the lawgiver. You also had in the synagogues Torah cabinets, place where they could put the scrolls of the law and protect them during the week or refer to them during the week as they studied, as they taught the young people, and of course in the synagogue services. And then one other feature that you'll notice in most of the synagogues is that the entrances often faced east. And again, east is an important direction connected to God and his presence in religious symbols. Now, if you go to an example of synagogues, this is the layout of the synagogue that we saw near Jericho. You see, again, we have the main hall right here with the columns around it. Then to the edges over here, you have the benches, and we'll see more of that in a little bit. And then you have over here different rooms that have to do perhaps with teaching or other kinds of meetings, because it also served as a community center as well. Then we had the entry court back here, and again you see where the entrance is toward, well, this part over here that faces east. They also had another entrance right down here. So that's the Jericho one as well. And then down here at the bottom you see the mikvot. That's kind of like what we would call a baptistry perhaps, and this is where they would go before they went in to worship and cleanse themselves, purify themselves so they could be pure as they worship the Lord. Now, go to the next one here. And there's another example. This is a Galilean type synagogue, and the difference here is that you have an upper loft where people sometimes sat. But as you look down below, you see again the main hall and the columns, and then toward the back you see room for the benches. You can't see those as well. And then you have the entrances over here. We learned on one trip to Israel that often there were 3 entrances, and the 2 on the outsides were for the people to come in and go out, and the middle one was reserved for the Messiah when he came. I don't know how widely that was believed, but that's one of the explanations that we received as well. Then if you go on through another map, we took a picture of this, I think, near Gamla, and this is a map of where they found ruins of different synagogues all through Israel. In particular, this is showing more of Galilee. And so quite a few, as you've seen. Not all of these, of course, are from Jesus' time, only a few, in fact. But you see how prevalent the synagogues were all through Galilee. Now, if you look also around the country, if you visit them physically, here is the synagogue in Masada. Remember, we had the story of Masada and the Zealots and their resistance against the Romans. We mentioned the talk that Eleazar, their leader, made to the people the night before the Romans broke through. Well, they met in this synagogue. This is the place where they were. Then if you go to Herodion, another place down near Bethlehem, one of the palace fortresses of Herod, this is Herod's synagogue in Herodion. This was actually used even much after the time of Herod, all the way up to the Bar Kokhba rebellion around 130 AD. And you can see how large that one is. Just to give you an idea, you have one person standing here in the middle of the synagogue. And then, of course, you see the columns and you see the benches to either side as well. All right, now we move over to Chorazin. And in Chorazin, they have a really well-preserved synagogue. And so if you go into the town, here's the entrance. And again, it's facing east. And you see there's the entrance on the left, and over here on the right, kind of partial, and then the larger entrance in the middle for the Messiah. Seen from the back, kind of elevated a little bit, this is the main hall of the synagogue at Chorazin. And you see just barely here part of the Bema, the little stone where you stand. Then over here by the door, the Moses seat. We'll show you that more. Then again, the columns, the main hall, and then benches on the side. One of the differences about this synagogue that's a little bit unusual is there are carvings of other gods, like there's one of Medusa. And you say, how'd that get in a Jewish synagogue? So again, the synagogues didn't always represent a perfect illustration of what God wanted in the synagogue. Sometimes there were things that weren't really supposed to be there. Now a little bit more ground view from that synagogue. Again, you get the idea of the size of it as you compare the people there and how big the building is. And then if we move over to another part of Galilee, this is to me one of the most interesting ones. It's the synagogue in Gamla. And we told the story of the Zealots at Gamla and how the Romans attacked the city there. And this again shows where the synagogue is in relation to the rest of the city, right down here toward the bottom of the hill as you go in the city. A little bit closer then you can see as you walk toward it. And then as you're standing kind of up on one of the benches to the back of the synagogue, again you see the typical structure of the main hall and the columns and the seats on the sides, and what's probably the Bema right here. And then we don't know exactly where the Moses seat was, probably up around this area. The entrance is over this way. Here is an example of the Bema that we talked about. This is the one in Chorazin. And again, this is where the reader of the law or the prophets would stand in the middle of the people and then read the word of God with great reverence. Scholars suggest that the reading of the law began perhaps or was based on the tradition of Ezra. We read in Ezra when the Israelites were reestablishing the temple and the law and the sacrifices, the altar, all that. In Nehemiah chapter 8, it says that Ezra stood up to read the law on a small platform in the midst of the people. And so some people think that this is the connection back with the Bema, where that might have begun. You see a friend of mine here, one of our group here, has his Bible open to the text in Luke 4 that we read a little bit earlier. So again, just to give you an idea of the size of it and where it's located within it. Now, if you move back to the synagogue at Gamla, you see an example of the Torah cabinet that we mentioned, where they would store the scrolls, and you see an example of a scroll here in the corner, right here, of this Torah cabinet. This one doesn't have a covering, but often, obviously, they would have a covering over it to protect the scrolls. Obviously, it would have had a roof on it as well. Sometimes it was more of a cabinet, which is like this one. This is actually one in a hotel in Israel that we saw. And you notice above the doors, it has the Ten Commandments in Hebrew. You have the name of Yahweh up here in Hebrew. You have the menorah on the doors, the candlesticks, right? And then you have what seems to be representations of the pillars on either side of the door of the temple in Jerusalem. Boaz and Jachin, they're called back when those were constructed. And then here's that example of the Moses seat that we mentioned in Chorazin. This is one of the better preserved ones. You see some of the carvings on it. See some of the lettering in Hebrew down here below as well. This synagogue and this seat is from the 4th century AD, time of the Byzantines, but likely very similar to the synagogues in the time of Jesus. Here's a little bit better view of how big it is, and again, just an idea. It's kind of fun to go there and read and sit in this place and read these stories about the synagogue and just imagine what it would have been like for Jesus to have been there. Now let's talk a little bit about the organization of the synagogue. It was governed by elders, the group of elders, and not necessarily elders in the sense that we might think of them today in the church, but similar, men who were older men, who had much more experience and knowledge in the law, respected in the community. And they governed the affairs of the synagogue, not only religiously, but also when the community would meet there as a community and make decisions about the city or the village, then the elders would also have some authority there. And they could also discipline the members or punish them by whipping them or even excommunicating them, throwing them out of the synagogue, which is what we see in John 9, when the blind man is healed and his parents are asked who is this guy that healed him? And the parents were afraid to answer because they didn't want to be thrown out of the synagogue. So again, they feared the authority of the elders and being thrown out of the synagogue. Then there were officials of the synagogue who were called the principals, the main ones that helped the elders, and they made sure everyone and everything followed the tradition that they were supposed to follow. Then there was the minister, or perhaps the servant, it's about the same word in Greek, who helped bring the scrolls and even sometimes chose children to read parts of the law and the prophets. We see that in some cases, some scholars suggest that perhaps everyone in the synagogue had a turn at reading the law and then sharing what that piece of the law had meant to them. Men and women, adults and children, which is interesting. That's kind of different than we might work. But according to some scholars, they suggest that was pretty common for there to be a plan of reading for the law and the prophets, with each section of scripture assigned to each Sabbath. And then the people would know when it was their turn to read. And so they could think about what they were going to say after they read. And if that's the case, then Jesus knew beforehand the day he was going to be in the synagogue would be the day that the portion of Isaiah would have been read. And so again, you realize how aware Jesus is of the prophecies about him and his mission, and how he took advantage of all those opportunities to help people understand who he was. And then this minister or servant that I just mentioned is also mentioned in that story that we read at the beginning, the one who received the scroll back from Jesus after he read. Now let's talk briefly about the 5 parts of the service of this in the synagogue. And again, this is at least every Sabbath, and often there were prayer services daily or special services during holidays of different kinds or celebrations of the community. But just about every service would begin with the Shema, the S-H-E-M-A, which is based on the Hebrew word for to hear, right? And the Shema is actually probably the best known piece of the law. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. You can see that. You had to recite it when you were studying, often the first thing they did in the synagogue service was to recite the Shema. And then you had to put it in that little mezuzah on your door frame. So often would write the Shema on a little sheet of paper, roll it up, and put it in the mezuzah, and screw the mezuzah into the door frame. And remember, every day as you went in and out, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, etc. And it goes on there through the rest of the chapter. So that's the first part of the service. And again, the most common, every Jewish child would have had this thing memorized by the time he was 2 or 3 years old, and was recited very frequently. Number 2 in the service were the prayers. And I understand there are 18 different blessings and petitions that were recited by the Jews, especially by the male Jews. And many of them were included in the synagogue services in different ways. They're also recited at other times during the day as part of people's prayers daily. The third part of the service in the synagogue was the reading, and this is the part that we've already seen in the text. According to what some scholars think, all the law is read every 3 years and could be followed by a reading from the prophets. The interesting thing is that some people suggest it was as much as 30 minutes of reading, and then perhaps the commentary was somewhere between 2 and 4 minutes on the reading that had been done. Now think of how that's flipped in many churches, where we have the sermon that lasts 30 to 40 minutes, and maybe the reading lasts a minute or two. And so it's interesting when you think about the customs, if everybody could participate, if everybody knew ahead of time and could prepare, and then if the emphasis was on the law, and then how the person's experience interacted with the law, what a different service that would be. Very personal, very applicable. I think that would be interesting to be in that service. Number 4, then there would be time of explaining the text, and as I mentioned, probably 2 to 4 minutes on average. And then number 5, there would be a blessing, a final prayer, and then a blessing of the people, maybe the blessing of number 6, the Lord bless you and keep you, like that. So again, a typical synagogue service, and obviously there's a lot of variety depending on what's read and who's participating, but that's the general structure that we understand was had. Someone also suggested, as an interesting concept, that perhaps Revelation is structured in the same form as a synagogue service. And if that's the case, that would be interesting to pursue as well. Now I want to show you just a few of the synagogues today in Israel. If you get to go to Israel and drive around, for example, you will see probably in Jerusalem the Herva synagogue, one of the older classical synagogues, very well known. Stood there for many years until it was destroyed in the war in the 20th century, and then recently just rebuilt. I think it was finished maybe in 2010 or 2011, perhaps, and you can go in. If you do, here is what it looks like, looking up toward that dome, very beautiful place. And then again, you look more down toward the floor, and you notice that you have in the middle, let's go back on that once, you have in the middle the place where they can read the law here in the middle, and then people are all around as well. Here's another synagogue called the Beit Alpha Synagogue. It's up toward Galilee. And one of the interesting features of this one is the well-preserved mosaic floor. There are several floors of synagogues in Galilee that have the signs of the zodiac. And again, I think we mentioned this briefly earlier, but it's not necessarily astrology, the signs of the zodiac. It could be that the heavenly hosts are represented as the hosts of God in the heavens surrounding God, and that on earth, then his people surround his presence, like in the Ark of the Covenant or in the temple, and perhaps the different signs of the zodiac are connected to the different tribes who are the people of God around the tabernacle or the temple. And so again, you have this zodiac sign on the floor there in Beit Alpha. You see more detail, beautiful mosaics. Probably took a lot of time to put this together. Then if you go over to Sepphoris, you also see a synagogue, and this is interesting because we wonder if this synagogue was the one in place or was being built when Jesus and his father perhaps were helping build that city. You remember that Sepphoris was a place where Herod Antipas, was building during the time Jesus was growing up in Nazareth. It was only about 3 miles away. And so as builders, craftsmen, it's likely that Jesus and Joseph went over there to help build that city and could have perhaps worshiped in this synagogue if this is the one from that time. Again, that's one of the ones that has interesting designs on the floor. And again, some of the signs of the zodiac. You can sit along or walk along this little wall here, this little fence, and look over that. Then often many of the hotels in Israel will have synagogues on some floor, or if you are a Jew traveling from other places, cities or countries, and you come, then you can go worship as well. You see this one has the Star of David on the roof, on the ceiling. You also see the place where you can read the law, again in the middle of the people, kind of like the Bema. And then you have the menorah up here in front as well. Now, if you go back to Jerusalem, you also have different synagogues. Obviously, there's not just one. The Herba we already saw. This one is Yochanan ben Zakkai synagogue as well. A little bit different structure. Beautiful again. Then this is the Istanbuli synagogue, and you might think, well, that's in Istanbul, but it's just that name of this one in Jerusalem. And again, you see the features of, room in the middle, and then you have seats on the side, and then area for reading the law. And then if you go to central Israel, up in what was Samaria, then you have the synagogue at Shiloh. And the reason this one is interesting is because it's close to the original tabernacle location when Samuel grew up with Eli and was raised there in the tabernacle at Shiloh. And so I think this synagogue is supposed to make us think of the tabernacle because it has the same shape and the same general appearance as the tabernacle would have had for the Israelites. And so if you go inside this one, again, it's a little bit different, but you have some of the same elements with the law and the seats and everything. So that's just a few of the synagogues that are in Israel that you can go see. Just some of the information available about the role of the synagogue. But I hope this is helpful as you move on in to study the life and the ministry of Jesus. We'll see you next time. God bless you. Bye-bye.